So welcome. This is another series in a series of conversations with leaders. I'm Mike Desjardins, CEO of Virtus, and I have the pleasure of having Yabome Gilpin-Jackson here today to have a timely conversation, a conversation that's probably 400 years overdue in terms of the outcome that's required. And I want to be really clear up front about why I decided to reach out to Yabome. We have a professional relationship in that our companies work together. Yabome is the VP of People and Culture for BC Lottery Corporation. And Virtus is in partnership with BC Lottery to develop leaders at the organization, including the executive team. So from an introduction perspective, I just wanted to share the connection. We've known each other for a long time, but more as acquaintances. We met years ago. We know a lot of people in common. And really what happened is when the George Floyd's murder occurred, it broke my heart. And it opened me up to the recognition of my own thoughts around race and racism. And I started getting curious about my own complicity in it, in whether it was a comment or a joke or a lack of action. And I realized that it was my own responsibility to start reading and learning. And so I did that. I started researching. I tried to find out from other CEOs and friends, what are you researching? What are you reading? I'm trying to figure out how to take action, but I don't want to take an action without educating and learning first. And I was on LinkedIn and I stumbled upon a blog post that you wrote, and it was, I can't breathe, and a wonderful follow-up post that was, I can't breathe. And it was the resource list. And you're such a wonderful writer that I kept going, and you have all the links there for further resources. And I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going. And I realized, I'm like, this is someone I know who has a PhD, who is an intelligent leader, who is also a parent, is a woman, is a Black woman in a leadership role, and is putting out amazing content. And I want to amplify her voice because I am in a position of power. I'm a 40-year-old CEO. I'm a white male. I belong to peer groups that are full of other CEOs. And I have the ability to get a message that I was reading from you that I felt needed a wider audience. And so I decided to reach out to you and see whether or not you were willing to have this conversation with me. So I wanted to give that context to be really clear about why we're doing this, and then start from there to give you the opportunity to share with everybody who's watching this, what is the message that needs to be out in the world right now? What is it that you want others to hear?
Thank you. And I just want to say, lots of gratitude for this conversation. I know you and I have spoken about it, and, I'm being really choosy about where and how I use my voice. And part of why I'm saying yes to this is because of the audience you just described. So to those of you watching and listening, senior leader audiences, CEO audiences, as a VP myself and a senior leader, but someone who's grown up in that field of supporting leadership and organization development, as I call it, literally grown up in that field. Started as an OD analyst out of MBA school and continued from there. I know that it can be quiet up in in that leadership realm. I know that that audience doesn't always hear the uncut or have a lot of direct dialogue brought to them on issues like this and most other things. And so it's important to me to speak to this audience and just be in conversation. So thank you for facilitating this. It feels important to me.
I think the comment that you make about the filtering, that a lot of times, and I know I've heard this in talking to executives and directors who are working on trying to provide information on direction or approach to the CEO, that there's always a comment, he or she likes to see it this way. And so the message that started off that was rich and deep and had meaning got watered down into a PowerPoint slide. And that's the conversation that I want to have today.
Yeah.
So, and so I appreciate, I know your candor in our earlier conversation, and I appreciate your candor. So where do we start? Where do we start this conversation?
Yeah. So yeah, I love that. And just for the record, that you are not going to get the filter, all of you. You're going to get whatever's true for me.
Wonderful.
Where do we start? I think we start. It feels to me there's two ways that I'd like to be in this conversation. One is just as a human. It's a human conversation, and you had some great comments about that, Mike, earlier, in terms of, you know, it's an issue of broken humanity that we're just face to face with in a new in some ways, but just in a heightened or different way, or, you know, in a more sort of collective conscious way, if you will. Because I know part of the conversation in my communities, there's a meme that's one of my favorite right now. It's two Black people in conversation at a coffee shop, and the cell phone is going off, and one person looks at the other, and the other one says, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's just all my white friends calling who think that racism is new." And it's unfortunate that a lot of us in my community feel that way right now. And so there's that human conversation that I'd like to have. And then there's the leadership conversation on the other side of it, and specifically the leading in organizations and at that CEO level. What does this look like? Because those two things go together. I think often we divorce humanity from our leadership, and that's critical. And so I think I want to enter the conversation those two ways, with the humanity first.
I think those words, humanity, we were referencing in our earlier conversation before we got started here today, that I spoke with a leader the other day, and she had someone ask her about, well, it was Me Too. That was the first thing that came up. And then it was COVID. And then now it's Black Lives Matter. Like, what's next? And, you know, she had to turn to that leader and say, well, Me Too was about broken humanity. And Black Lives Matter is 400 years of broken humanity that we're being awoken to now. We should have been awake much more, a lot longer ago. COVID is a virus. They're potentially going to find a vaccine or a treatment for it. I don't think Me Too or there's a vaccine for that. That is part of our shared humanity that needs to be fixed. And Black Lives Matter and racism and anti-racism is part of our shared humanity that is broken, and it needs to be fixed. So there is no end date. There is no next thing that comes after this.
Well, and I want to amplify that and sort of look at it another way as well. There is no vaccine for, you know, the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter and anti-racism work in general, because the vaccine is us.
Right.
It really is us. This one is under our control. Humanity, created a system. And this is one of the things I found myself talking about a lot. You know, the argument of, you know, but I wasn't here for this 400 years ago. I didn't do this. No, you didn't, but we did. Humanity, someone in a room somewhere or over time, created a social stratification system when it comes to racism that put people on a scale from lightest to darkest. And the world became structured that way. And so we've inherited this structure, but that doesn't make us helpless to change it, because this one is under our control. We are the vaccine for this. And we have to look at things and say, you know, I wasn't here when this was made up 400 years ago, that Black people are only fit to be slaves and fit to be, you know, presented into the world as less than human, because what is part of this issue is the constant dehumanizing Blackness and Black people over time. And again, it's a scale. So, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that identity group, when it comes to race, the broad identity group has been coming together, understanding more and more that, it's a scale. We're all in it, sort of on the, unfortunately, socially, not personally, socially on the bottom half of the scale, saying, you know what, this has to be toppled on its head, and we have to change this stratification. It's not working for everybody. And we're simply saying we want to go from this to this.
Mm-hmm.
And we, the collective we, all of us, need to do that. It's an us issue. As Austin Shannon Brown, she has the book called "I'm Still Here: Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness." It's a book that's going around right now. I haven't read it yet, but I've listened to the podcast with Brene Brown. And she says the work of anti-racism is learning to be better humans to other humans. Mm-hmm. We can all do that. I need to do that too. I'm a cisgender woman when it comes to gender issues. So right. I will make mistakes there too. So I need to learn to be a better human to humans in that people group and in that identity group. And so it's just all of us. Where do we have to do work? And when it comes to the racial question, that really all the Black Lives Matter movement is asking for is, are you willing to be a better human to us? Because we're telling you something's not working for us 400 years till today.
The challenge that you present, as I've been learning and reading the last little bit, this piece around this shared humanity, it's for us to fix. And I really hope that that message is understood. What my fear is that there's an expectation, well, we should have asked Black people how to solve this for us.
Yeah.
We did this, we live in this place of white supremacy. I understand the position of power that I'm in. I understand that it's not equal, and there's no reason for it not to be equal. We're human beings. There's no reason for that to be that way, but it is that way. And so I understand the responsibility is not for us to ask the Black community, teach us how not to be racist. That's just doesn't make any sense to me. We did this, it's for us to fix. And to say that, as you said earlier, well, I wasn't around 400 years ago. I didn't have slaves. That's not part of I don't feel that I am racist. Is not, the work of anti-racism is about taking action to correct an inequity that is not humane, and it has not been humane for a long time. And for us to say that we live in shared humanity in a global society, it's up for us to educate ourselves on how we can make a difference. Because the last thing I want to do, last thing I think we should do is place that on the person who has been harmed.
Thank you. I want to respond to that in two ways. I love that. One, the other analogy I've been using in different communities, and it's hard and it's tricky and it's messy all around. I am tired.
I get that.
Physically, mentally, psychologically, and I am staying in this conversation. I'm having this conversation in my church, challenging the Christian community in terms of what it looks like to take a stand, because again, there's that sort of split, guilt and shame and arguments around, but the church has always been there to help, and the church has been complicit, and there's lots of history around that. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here is choose and do what's needed now, right? So I'm having these conversations there. I'm having these conversations in community. I'm having these conversations in the circle around, the Zoom table with other friends that we're just trying to support each other. And it's tiring, and I'm staying in. And I'm staying in, and in those conversations, part of what I'm saying to people is, you know, depending on the audience, and of course we live in the Pacific Northwest in BC, so the Black population here is quite small. It's 2 to 3% in the province. And so it feels like a heavier burden, because just by defaulting being in the room, you know, the experience of being the only Black person, let alone the only Black woman, is a usual one for me now. And what I've been saying to people, especially with you know, my broader white friends, colleagues, humans together, is it's sort of like saying to someone who tells you I'm being bullied, or, you know, I think you may be turning a blind eye to the fact that I'm being bullied because I keep coming to you, telling you about this issue, and then you responding and saying, but I'm not a bully. So maybe what I'll invite you to do is go talk to the person bullying you and tell them how to stop bullying you, right?
Like,
so, and I use bullying because it's sort of a, you know, forget race. I think we can all connect with the idea of bullying or being bullied. So it really is that. It's basically us saying, no, go talk to the person bullying you because I'm not a bully. Go tell them how to stop bullying you. How well is that going to go? How well is that going to go? And I just want to draw another analogy for the, you know, CEO leader audience is, we know this experience from the experience of having positional power in organizations, and sort of calibrating what can I take on versus what you know, where can I share the load and where do I delegate. But we all know, like, from situational leadership, it depends on the situation. It's not always here, I delegate it to you, you go figure out the answer, because sometimes that equals abdicating responsibility.
Right.
And I think when it comes to this conversation and figuring out, you know, what's our role from the leadership power place, to say, you all go figure it out, this case is abdicating responsibility, because you're the power holder. And you know, on the racial spectrum, you know, if the people who are the structural power holders are saying, well, we can't be part of this because it wasn't us and we don't know how to deal with it, then you're leaving the people who structurally and systemically have no power to continue trying to claim their space and use, you know, the collective and other forms of power that they have to try and claim their space. But that's a harder route to a solution. We all know historically we can get there by just that grassroots movement and all of that. But it's a harder road to get there, and it's a longer road. And we're saying, let's do this better.
I think your example of leaders, I thank you for the analogies, because the thing I've struggled with in the past couple of days is I love using analogies. And the thing I've struggled with is that all of the analogies that came to mind were either trite or they didn't carry the weight. They just didn't carry the weight. And I realized that if I try to use an analogy right now, I'm going to simplify something, and I don't want to give somebody an analogy that's going to let them off the hook, I guess, is what I was worried about. And I love the analogy that you gave. I think the one that we use for leaders a lot is that as we get into these positions of power, we don't realize other people can see the position of power that we're in. And we forget that we have it because we don't have the experience. It's almost this and I'm constantly aware of trying to be self-aware around the wake that I leave behind me. I will say to CEOs all the time, you're a cruise ship plowing through the water with a massive wake behind you. And all the people that are reporting up to you are in different sized boats, but they're not in cruise ships. And you are responsible for the wake you leave behind you. And it feels like here, there's this opportunity for leaders to use the power of that cruise ship to turn the direction, and also to make sure that they're supporting the leaders that are, you know, behind them in their wake.
Yeah. I love that too. I think it's, you know, sort of in organizational change, we say to leaders, you're ahead. You might have been thinking about this strategy, this direction for months, sometimes years, and all of a sudden the moment is right and you lean into it. Don't forget that the people behind you, they're just trying to process what this means for them now. And often, as you know, that's a classic sort of CEO/leadership mistake when we don't think about the impact for people. And it's in that what you described there in the cruise ship and the wake, it's sort of the blindness of positional power. And right. And what I'm going to evoke here is another language that, again, I'm sort of hearing my white friends and colleagues say, I'm just hearing this now and I'm going old news, white privilege. You know, and some reactivity to white privilege. And I've been saying to folks, don't react to it, try to understand it. White privilege, you know, and this is literally theory, check any sociology textbook, check any, you know, anti-racism educational materials. You know, it's language that's been used to describe the fact that, again, you didn't ask for it. We were born into, unfortunately, a social order that was created this way. And we inherit the social order because the world was organized that way and people lived that way. And in that social order, lightest to darkest, you know, white to black, and then there's this everything in between, you have white privilege, which means the world was organized for you, for your, primarily for your benefit first. And you either have it or you don't. And I certainly don't have it. So I've been saying to friends, you either have it or you don't. And you can choose to not look at it or deny it, or you can choose to face it and become conscious about it. Because like I say, the fact that you don't know what it is or you haven't had to think about it means you have it. Right?
Yes.
It's the VIP
right.
pass to the world. It's the VIP pass, right? It's the next pass. You go ahead. You don't see what people who are waiting in the line are dealing with, and you don't have to because you're in the VIP lounge. So if you become aware of that, so I always say privilege is not the issue. It's the responsibility and what you do with privilege. And when you realize that you have privilege that's harmful, are you willing to give that up? And that's another challenge I'll put out. And you know, there's a difference between this, you know, social ranking we're talking about and personal power and personal privilege. And I am so thankful. You know, I come into this conversation with a very global lens, which is why I can also say to people, it's not a US problem. It's a global problem when it comes to peoples of African descent. I was born to Black African parents who had educational privilege, you know, through scholarships, and they came to Canada in the 60s. My dad studied here, and then they chose to leave. I have siblings that were born here. They chose to leave with those siblings, and the rest of us were born many different parts in the world. I was born in Germany. And then eventually, because they were worried about the state of the world and the impact on our identities and psyche, they said, you know what? Let's take all of our children, there were a lot of us, 8 of us.
It's a big family.
You know, back to Sierra Leone in West Africa, because we want them to understand their African roots and their Black identity in a different way. It was, as I understand it, from my parents, part of their and back to Sierra Leone. I'm so glad they did. Because what that means for me is I was able to have the experience of being immersed in a society where that was majority Black, and I saw role models, and I had, you know, I had that experience of belonging by default. And that's why I also know, because of that, that when I left that context, the racial ranking became so much more overt. Of course, it exists in the African setting because of colonialism. There's such a ranking there in terms of, you know, even expatriate communities and white communities, development communities. Again, the issue here is not whether you mean well when you're part of those communities, but the power imbalance is there in those societies where, you know, that expatriate Western white audience and other audiences attached to a Western ideology are given privilege, even in, you know, especially in African context because of the colonial history and because of the orientation and the narrative of, poor Africa, dark Africa, all of that. That's another conversation that connects to this one as we're experiencing it in the West. But I'm saying that because when I left that context, the racial ranking happened so quickly in terms of, coming to Canada. And I love how in Vancouver, we think there's no racism here. I was telling the story the other day that within months of arriving here, I had the security following me through the mall, me and a girlfriend experience. And she had grown up here, so she was unfortunately used to it. And she said to me, he's following us. And I'm like, come on, don't be so paranoid. I know this happens, but that can't possibly be why. The security followed us for 5 stores. And then came up to us and asked us if we were okay and what we were needing, because apparently what had happened is we went to one store, tried a whole bunch of things, didn't buy anything and left. And we think that someone from that store called security. And I don't know if they thought we had shoplifted or something. And this is right here in Vancouver in, 99. And so, and from then to today, in the middle of this situation, I had a car full of what looked to me a car full of white men rev up at an intersection to get my attention. I look up and they were doing hand gestures and mouthing off and pointing at me. I kept my windows up, drove through the intersection and left and came home stunned, thinking really in the middle of this can happen. Now, people might say those are isolated incidents, but here's where the systemic and institutional comes together. Because the fact is, in all those incidents, even if I reported it, there's not enough no tolerance in our different institutions that I could have gone to that anything significantly different would happen because of any of those incidents. And that's what we're saying. There needs to be zero tolerance. I know colleagues in the city that I live that have called the cops because there was a self-avowed white supremacist harassing them. They coach soccer. A Black colleague of African descent who immediately moved here and married to a white Canadian. And they coach soccer, and a self-avowed, there was evidence to this white supremacist would go by and, throw the N-word, say, go home, leave here consistently. And they did call the cops. And there was not much that was done for many reasons. And of course, I'm not going into policy or, police policy or reasons why. But bottom line, this individual hadn't done enough for them to intervene. So then I asked, do we wait until somebody is harmed? Do we wait until enough looks like, a knee on a neck before anything is done? So, and that's the systemic connection. And that's where, leaders and CEOs with power recreate your organizational systems. Think about the practices and policies that are not only proactive, but also that not only espouse a no tolerance, but act on no tolerance when there's reports and incidents. So don't wait for the reports and incidents is my message. Like, how can you look at all of your policies through an anti-racist lens? And I know we all have, non-discriminatory policies. It's been legislated for a long time. And people are saying, well, it's not enough. I still have these experiences, and I still have these ceilings, as you were saying earlier. The gender glass ceiling in organizations is a bit more attended to. Well, there's everything else. So no, don't just say I have an anti-bullying, anti-discriminatory policy. Look at it from an anti-racist lens. Make sure it proactively and explicitly attends to anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-racism across the spectrum, and then be willing to act on it with no tolerance.
I think you bring up that point around the no tolerance, the piece around culture that I think is lost sometimes in the cultural conversation for organizations is that they say, well, we put this out in our newsletters. The CEO speaks about culture all the time. We talk about diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, right? Like, we have programs and training, and my response to that is, your culture is as much what you let slide as it is what you say your culture is. And I think that one of the challenges is, and you raised it earlier, is that if you haven't been in the position of being followed in the mall, because you're being thought of as potentially shoplifting. If you haven't been in your car by yourself and had somebody that is stronger than you and multiple parties in the car next to you, yelling things out at you, giving hand gestures to you, whatever that is. If you've never experienced that, then you don't understand what it feels like to have racism, to be attacked and to have the violence of racism in your life. And so to be on the other side, the completely other side of that spectrum, and say, well, I don't understand my privilege. It's twofold. Because if I don't understand my privilege, then I don't understand what it feels like to live with racism. And I think that the challenge that we face, that I worry about, the thing I worry about most, is that the thought that me reducing my white supremacy is a loss for me, without considering, well, actually, I've done nothing to earn it. And there are people that have the opposite of that going on for them. And so for them to have equal, I guess, supremacy, I guess equality is the word I'm looking for, equality in their humanity, for there to be equality, I'm not worse off in equality. And I worry that from, I think the term that I've read is white fragility, is the fear that if I try to fix this, then I'm giving away something. And I don't think that that's true. I think that what we're doing is I'm saying that I recognize that there is a part of humanity that has been broken for a very long time, and I'm in a position of power to do something about it. And I have control over systems. I have control over culture, and I have the ability to change tolerance policies so that there is no tolerance, because there are lots of things in organizations that CEOs have zero tolerance for. And this just needs to be one of them, I think.
Well, exactly. And, this is where I worry, because one size doesn't fit all. And it is hard. Mike, as you and I know, anything development is hard. And this is a need for humanity to collectively develop together. And it's not easy. And, people say, well, what do I do? It's not just a single one thing. It's, yes, educate yourself, but speak up and act and change your policies. And, if you see another person in a power role pulling punches, that's zero tolerance. Like, be willing. And I know it's hard. And I know that's part of it. And my biggest worry is that people are going to stop trying because it's hard. And, the wave is going to, run its course, sort of like the comment that you were told about Me Too and COVID-19. This is not a blip. To the point of the meme I explained to you, people in my community are like, right? And I worry both about the resignation I hear in my community and the loss of faith and hope in humanity, as I do worry about in my white colleague and friends communities that you'll get tired too quickly because we can't afford to. It's not okay. This is our shared humanity. And yes. I love people who talk about white supremacy, who also talk about the loss to you. What are you numbing in your humanity that's allowing, and you, the collective you, not you, Mike.
I'm okay with that.
Well, no, as I say to people, in the parts of our communities classified as white, because you really are only classified as white. Right. This is the human race we're talking about here. Yeah. What are you numbing in yourself that's allowing you to bypass these very real harms? I am somebody who has a really strong identity core and personal, sense of personal power. And I say that not lightly. I say that having done tons of personal and leadership work, born into the family I was born into, acknowledging of the privilege that even that gave me in African and Black communities, because of the, the luck of the draw or whatever providence that had me born into the family with the level of access and education that I was born into. So that's privilege too. But I'm aware of it, I acknowledge it, and I'm not running from it. And I'm not saying I'm done and I'm complete, but I'm really, because of that strong identity core and parents who, you know, lived and studied here in the 60s, who were just like, you can do anything, you can be anything. And then, of course, as I described, going back into, you know, predominantly Black society gave me another vantage point and awareness of, you know, when I see CNN only showing rural African poor people and, you know, snotty-nosed kids and espousing how, you know, the world is suffering and yet they're only showing Black images, I'm going, that's not all of it. That's not the whole picture. And that's a very skewed picture. And that's continuing to purport the very historical and systemic issues that we're talking about. But I could see that because I wasn't just immersed in this society. And that was helpful to me. And yet, I am impacted and was very quickly impacted as soon as I moved predominantly into Western societies on the day-to-day. And so to say, you know, I don't see it, it doesn't exist, or it must be isolated incidents, or what have you, is not okay. That's numbing. It's taken away from your humanity as much as it's taken away from mine.
I think coming into this conversation, even as I started to do my own learning, I had a fear. I was afraid that I would say the wrong thing. I was afraid in even reaching out to interview you that it wasn't okay to reach out to interview you. I was afraid that you might misinterpret why I was reaching out and the intent behind it. And I realized that if fear is going to paralyze me, and I'm not a person I'm not a shrinking violet. And if I feel that fear, then I worried about how that others who were similar, who were in a place of white supremacy, would feel similar fear, and that fear would lead to inaction, and we'd be in the same damn place we were before George Floyd was murdered. And I said, it's not okay. And I said to myself, well, if I don't take the risk to do this, and this is not me espousing greatness in the act of reaching out to you to have an interview by any stretch. It was more my own recognition that it was something I could do, and it was an action, and that probably the actions that feel scary, that I have fear around, are probably the ones I need to go do. And that if I'm worried about being perfect, that's going to be the enemy of me making any progress. And I hope that through me sharing this, but through our conversation, that if you're watching this right now and you're watching this conversation that we're having and you feel that way, that you don't feel alone in that fear. It's okay to be afraid. It's our, you know, it pales in comparison to the fear of walking through life, knowing that at any point racism could be used against you, and that is completely outside of your control. And to have to second guess things that occur in your life, do they have anything to do with the color of my skin? Is that why I didn't get the job?
Exactly.
Is that why the police were following me? Is that why I got pulled over? I don't ever have to have that. And so that fear is, and that concern to go through an entire life like that, I've had a couple of weeks of this fear of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing. And now I fear more inaction on my own part and than anything else. I'm curious. I'm curious to hear. I loved your analogy about bullying, by the way. I loved it because it just resonated with me, because it's an analogy that you won't go to the person that's being bullied and say, although your daughter, was it your daughter in her speech? Was that to a city council or to the school board that she was speaking? I wasn't clear who she was speaking to.
City council.
Yeah. So, and I loved her telling her story, and the fact that, you know, she has teachers coming to her and telling her what she should do about this. She's the one being bullied. She's the one experiencing racism. She's the one that is sitting by herself and wondering and finding it strange why she doesn't have a group to work with in the class, and that somehow that's incumbent upon her to do something about it, and it just isn't.
Yeah, and you got it. That's the other thing. You know, funnily, because I moved back here as a young adult, you know, end of teenage, young adult, I adjusted, I sort of sense made. I found my way to move through university and sort of ignore / it's a survival instinct, right? You know, talk to people in Black communities, and there's different ways we all deal. And, you know, I recognized it very quickly and thought, you know, and I'm just going to keep plowing through and do my merit thing, and my merit will speak for itself, you know. And then I get to those points where I'm like, my merit didn't quite speak for itself in that situation. And then I start to question, should I be actually facing the fact that, you know, maybe the gender and race thing is playing in here? I actually remember, I won't go into details, but I remember the point that I walked away from a conversation, twofold conversation, one not positive and another one for, you know, someone you might call a white ally that recognized some oddities in the conversation, called me aside and said, that didn't sit well with me. But again, this person, you know, starting to process, work through their own stuff, didn't necessarily say something to the other person in the interaction, and said, and I'm looking at you and who you are and all your credibility, your credentials and everything. And I just find myself thinking, really, if you were a different person, this is a very different conversation. And I sort of laughed it off. You know me, I have this big laugh. And I walked away, and I remember the sensation of going into my car and thinking, did I really just become that Black woman who's the most qualified one in the room and suddenly got put down? And, you know, more qualified than anybody in the space, least listened to, working twice as hard. I remember driving home and my knuckles were shaking a bit. All of that I could deal with. But when it started happening to my children, as you heard with my daughter, that's when I started speaking out beyond just dealing with it myself. When my kindergartner says, you know, casually, what do I answer when people ask me where I'm from? And she was born here. Me, you might still say, you know, a weird combination of
Germany.
A third culture kid, right? And you know, a weird combination of a third culture kid and a first generation immigrants, whatever you might, whatever label you want to put on it.
Yeah.
She was born here, and in kindergarten, she's already wondering what she should answer when people ask her where she's from, because all of a sudden she's having this dissonance of, do I belong here? I was born here. Am I Canadian? Am I not? Why are people asking me this? Right? Or a son who comes home after, you know, well-meaning, well-intentioned presentation on, you know, service and missions to the world and, you know, helping and, you know, a donation drive for something or the other. And he comes home and says, Mom, I don't want to be African anymore. I sort of take a deep breath and look at him and I say, why? He said, well, because all Africans are poor and they just always show poor people and poor kids. And I don't want to be like that. So I don't want to be African anymore. And I will say this, I have not actually told this part of the story in the audience as I've told this story, which is why retelling is good, because it builds up the courage, talking about fear. He said to me, I'm going to marry a white girl because then my children won't be as brown as I am. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It was one of the hardest conversations for me to navigate without having him see anything wrong with whiteness, because that wasn't the point. Or, you know, he may well fall in love with a white woman when he's older, and a part of me is always going to wonder whether that thought got lodged in his mind
at a young age.
When he was in elementary school and he never could get it out. So this is insidious. That's what I mean. And for me, when it started to happen with my children, the level of how it systemically is continued, and the fact that those teachers, well-meaning, were not prepared for it. They didn't understand how to deal with it. They didn't recognize their own privilege or their own blindness in the fact that race was playing a part in her experience, the benign ones. And then there was the explicit, she started being told nobody wants to play with a little Black girl. And then, of course, at that point, we intervened and worked through it and like refused to back down. It was a long road. I won't go into the details, but the fact that we have schools that are not prepared, where, you know, we're starting to celebrate diversity and multiculturalism, and we talk about it a lot in Canada, but not Black history. It's not Black multiculturalism. It's still optional. Lots of schools don't do anything for Black History Month. So these Black kids are celebrating everybody else's history, and they don't see themselves. They don't see their representation. Hence, you know, my child coming back and saying, well, and when I see Black representation, it's only poor African kids, so I don't want to be African.
Your son, my heart breaks to hear that for him. And the word you use, insidious, it makes me think it's in the air.
Yes.
And so I can't see the air. Yeah. And when something gets that place of being insidious, it's in everything. And so how do you see, unless we take the time to stop and to educate ourselves and to learn, I you know, in the learnings I've done in the past couple of weeks, I realized that, like, when have I been racist? When have I said racist thing? When have I laughed at a joke that actually is racist? When have I made a statement or used a piece of vernacular that actually has a racist overtones to it that I didn't understand where that came from? And I started researching phrases that I'd read in books, and I'm like, oh, that's what that means? Oh my God, I had no idea that that's what that meant. I don't want to say that ever again. And I think the insidious nature of it, you know, calls upon us to just to continue to look and know that it's not going to be, it might not be obvious at first. Even to this, I was watching a sitcom. I can't remember the name of the sitcom now. I wish I could remember. It's on Netflix. And it's a Black family, and the father is a writer for comedy shows. And the show is like, it's phenomenal. It's such a funny show. And there's a point in the show when he talks about wanting to throw a party for Juneteenth.
Yes.
And
Blackish, like, I think you're talking about.
Blackish, yeah. And I'm like, what's Juneteenth?
Yeah.
And then they explain it in the show, and I'm like, how am I 48 years old and I don't know what Juneteenth is? Like, how is that even possible? And the significance of why the date exists. Like, at first I'm like, oh, okay, it's a date. It sounds like there's going to be a party because they're describing they're having a party. But then they start to explain, his daughter is doing a documentary at the time of her father and of her family, explains the significance. So then I jump online and I start reading, and I'm like, I went to university and I was accepted into history honors before I went into commerce. How do I not know this? Like, how this is an important date, and I don't even know about this date.
Yes.
That's what insidious looks like. Like,
well, and here's the thing. Here's the other, you know, this is a global issue for people of African descent, because this is where it starts. When we went back to Sierra Leone, grew up in Freetown. So those of you who don't know what Juneteenth is, please Google it. You can also Google Freetown. And, you know, the Canadian denial were not part of this. A big part of the population that made up Freetown, the short form is, it was basically a colony for freed slaves, that, you know, a piece of land that was bought from what's now Sierra Leone, from the local indigenous people there at the time, and by abolitionists, and that, you know, as a safe haven to take freed and descendants of freed slaves back who wanted to go back. A big part of the people who went back was a big shipment from Nova Scotia, because they were Black loyalists who were not receiving the promise they were told they will receive for fighting with the British and then being sent to Canada and given land. And that's still part of the conversation today, because even the fact that their lands were never given to them and reparations are needed in Canada only came up because of a UN report a couple of years ago. You can Google it, you'll find all of this. But I grew up in Freetown, and it was an old British colony. So I did tons of British history. I studied Shakespeare. I was the generation where Black literature was just starting to be brought into the curriculum. So I maybe did 2 Black literature books. And then, so there's people like me that intentionally decided to educate themselves. I am Black, I am African, and there's parts of my history. And I had an advantage, remember, because I was in African context. So there were some things that I, just subliminally got, or because I grew up in Freetown, the Nova Scotia history comes up, and a big part of our population is those descendants of the folks that came from Nova Scotia, and then some from England, and then some who were repatriates, they were called, who were the people on the slave ships that when slavery was illegal, but it was still happening. If a ship was apprehended and people were released, they didn't know where to take all of them, so they took them back to Freetown. That population is the Creole people of Freetown. I'm married to a Creole man. So, there's all kinds of ways where the historical significance cannot even be lost on me for all those reasons. But even there's tons I've had to research and learn. And to your point earlier, I'll be in conversations, and yes, in the unconsciousness of not knowing because you weren't educated, people say things all the time, and I just let it slide. So even this conversation about, sometimes I hear, Black people or Indigenous people, they need to stop playing the victim and move on. Really? Really?
Always said by the person who hasn't
knew.
been oppressed and have faced racism.
Right? And if you only knew the day-to-day comments that I have to let go, because I'm not going to be the racial police at executive tables or, around the leadership table where I'm always saying, do you know what you just said? Because it's not always appropriate to. So yes, awareness starts with educating ourselves. And then to our point earlier, move beyond that and think about what are the actual anti-racist things you can do. Teach your children. Because again, another sign of white privilege is if you've never had to have these conversations with your children, if you've never had to worry when George Floyd was happening, we're like, do we hide from the kids when we're watching CNN? Do we whatever else we're watching to catch up on the news? How much of this do we make them see? And, my husband and I just looked at ourselves one evening and we're like, it's not like they don't already know. Kayla already had to go stand up and she's 12 now. She knows. So then we just made it an opportunity for family conversation. But our family conversation looks different. We have to wonder also the impacts on them.
I'm recognizing in what you just shared for my own family and for our own conversations, because I have an 8-year-old daughter, and to have her, to have her understand the history of racism and what it means to stand up and to be an anti-racist and to be an ally, and to also educate her on the history, because it's interesting, the algorithms that exist in the world. People talk about Facebook and Google and Amazon only serving you up the content that is consistent with what you bought or what you watched, right?
Yes, yeah.
But before that existed, the books that I got recommended to me, the education that I got, all of that was also curated for me. And so it's incumbent upon me.
And for me.
Sure,
right?
yeah.
In the colonial world, I got colonial education. So we all got the work to do.
Well, and so I recognize that it's incumbent upon me I have to go search out. So when I was reading in Me and White Supremacy, what was the last work you read by a Black author? And I realized, oh, darn, I'm currently reading it. That's the last one. And then I thought to myself, when I looked at my bookstore in Apple Books, like, well, it's only making recommendations off the things that I've read before, which are a lot of business books, or, I like spy novels. And then I think about the movies that I watch and the shows that I watch. And so my Netflix queue is a lot of the popular cinema. And I would have, if a show came on and it was a show that was featured an all Black cast, my thought would have been, well, that's not a show for me.
Yeah.
That's a show for a different audience. And I realized when I thought that, I'm like, okay, I'm actually filtering out content because it isn't aligned with my, as you say, my colonial upbringing and education and my whiteness. It's just not consistent with it. And I can't possibly learn. And so Blackish was one of the shows that I watched a month and a half ago. But I watched it and I thought, this is fantastic. And and then now going through this learning and this education, I'm like, yeah, but I thought differently about it when I watched it. I thought, well, this is about a Black family and I'm going to learn about Black families. And then I finished it and I'm like, no, it's about a family and they have the same family dynamics. And it's not a Black show. They're just the family's Black. But I realized the racism inherent in the thought process that I had. And I think that I would run so quickly to saying that I'm not racist, that doing that actually stops me from learning. It stops me from growing, and it stops me from recognizing that, no, I've said racist things. I've laughed at racist jokes for any race. I don't mean just for sure. People that are Black and yet I've been sheltered on the other side, and that there are really no white people jokes, right? Like there's not a lot of, like, I don't get exposed to that as being something that is part of my life. And so my eyes being open to this, and my eyes being open in our conversation today, because again, I've learned, and this is another part of my learning, is just having this conversation with you. And I want to thank you I'm grateful for you being willing to take the time. I understand that, well, one, I understand as a busy VP, you're busy already. And so I appreciate that as a Black woman, who I'm sure is getting lots of requests for people to chat with right now, and that is not your job. Your job is not to educate me. Your job is not to educate the people around you. But I appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation so that I can get this message out, that you shared with us today, and get your perspective out to a wider audience, who I hope takes the time to hear your words and will have the learning that I have. And I hope it's part of spurring, I'm going to speak to the viewers. I hope this spurs you on to just make this part of your life, to make this work part of who you are, and never stop, because it can't ever stop until it changes. And it's going to take a lot of people. It's going to take a lot of time. And there's no, if you're wondering, oh, I'm busy, I'm tired from COVID, I'm exhausted with my own work right now, I've got a family, I've been homeschooling my kids, whatever the excuse is, there's always going to be an excuse. Settle in for the marathon, because this Black Lives Matter is not a sprint. Welcome to the marathon. It's going to take us a while. Well, thank you so much for making time for this conversation today. Is there any, in sort of closing words, is there anything else that you want to say, a message that you want to put out into the world before we wrap?
I can't thank you enough, Mike. I said to you earlier that I'm really choosy in the exhaustion of all of this, in where I use my voice and where I speak up. And this feels important, feels like an audience that I would like to hear this kind of conversation. So thank you for listening, those of you who've been listening. This feels like a call to our generation. It's a marathon. We have a pivotal choice to make in this 400-year history. And I would just say, what do we want history to remember us as a generation, as a cohort, and also as leaders in organizations and institutions and CEOs that have huge influence on the world. So, what's the impact? And I know that can feel scary and big, but it really is the cumulative impact of every little decision and policy that becomes the insidious. And this feels like a call to us to be intentional and clear-eyed, and a lot conscious about anti-Black racism and anti-racism in general, in the mark we leave on the world. We'll be leaving organizations for our children to inherit, and they're going to inherit whatever we set up. So this is just a call to be thinking about that as we move forward. I can't stop. I don't have a choice. And I hope that others will choose humanity with me.
If
Thank you.
this, I appreciate hearing all of that. I'm going to say to all of you who are watching this right now, if you're hearing this and you've been on Google and you're feeling overwhelmed, then you need a place to start. The place I started was by buying the book by Layla Saad, that is Me and White Supremacy. There's everyone in the operations team at Virtus is reading that book right now, and we're getting together to have the conversations. It's a book you can do. It's not a book you just read. It's 28 days of journaling and checking in around what white supremacy really means, and having deep contemplation. We've also hired a facilitator to come in and do a session. It's called Me and My Whiteness. And we're starting that. It starts in a couple of weeks. And so there's what action looks like. Find, that doesn't have to be the book. There are lots of books. I'm not going to ask Yabome to do that work for you, because that's not her job. Your job is to go look and go research and read, and find that there are people out there that will help you, that will come into your company and support you. And it doesn't take a lot of work to find them. They're there and they're ready. They might be tired of having this conversation, but they're still going to be there. So if you think you're tired, they've been tired for a long time, and they're still showing up to do the work, to support and to help make the difference. So,
and I'd just say, feel free to post also the link to my post and resource list.
Yes.
That's also
absolutely. I'll post that.
For the Canadians who are thinking it doesn't happen here, there's a Canadian-oriented sort of Black Canadian experience that's there as well. So, and also a bit of a global lens, so that people don't experience this just as an American thing. So feel free to post that as well.
I'm going to post when this gets posted, your blog there'll be a link to your blog and all of your writing in there, because we've referenced some of your blog posts in this talk. The video of your daughter speaking to City Council will be in there as well. So I want to, again, express my gratitude to you, Yabome, for taking the time. I so appreciate this. And so this has been Yabome Gilpin-Jackson. I am Mike Desjardins, and this has been Conversations with Leaders.